On the morning of January 18, 1781, Lord Charles Cornwallis was at his headquarters camp on Turkey Creek in South Carolina when the first reports arrived from Cowpens. According to an American prisoner of war who witnessed the scene, Cornwallis listened to Tarleton's account of what had happened the previous day and, as the full scope of the disaster became clear, leaned so hard on the hilt of his sword that the blade snapped in half under his weight. 110 of his men killed, 712 captured, 2 cannon lost, 2 regimental standards gone. 86% of an entire strike force eliminated in under an hour. And Banastre Tarleton himself had escaped with 54 men, the remnant of the most feared cavalry command in British North America. The best unit Cornwallis had in the Southern Theater, the force he had used to chase down and destroy every American commander who had tried to hold territory in South Carolina since the spring of 1780, had been effectively wiped off the field by a former wagon driver from Virginia who spent the night before the battle walking barefoot through his camp by firelight, talking to his militia one man at a time. So how did Daniel Morgan design and execute one of the most tactically complete victories in American military history against a commander who had never yet been beaten, in a cow pasture, in the dark, with 1 day's notice? By January of 1781, the British Southern strategy had achieved almost everything it had set out to do and produced almost none of the results that were supposed to follow. Charleston had fallen in May of 1780, the largest British victory of the entire war. General Horatio Gates had been routed at Camden in August. The Continental Army in the South effectively destroyed for the second time in 3 months. Cornwallis was operating with the confidence of a commander who had already broken organized resistance and was now principally engaged in holding territory, suppressing guerrilla activity, and positioning himself for the decisive march north into Virginia that he believed would end the war. The problem was that the suppression of guerrilla activity required constant use of his best offensive instrument, the British Legion and Tarleton's cavalry, and the Carolina backcountry was producing an endless stream of men willing to keep the guerrilla campaign going. Kings Mountain in October 1780 had killed or captured the entire Loyalist militia force that was supposed to anchor the British hold on the Carolina interior. The partisan operations of Francis Marion in the east and Thomas Sumter in the central districts kept British supply lines under constant pressure. And now Nathanael Greene, the new American commander in the South, had done something almost inexplicably aggressive given the size of his force. He had divided his already outnumbered army into 2 pieces. One piece stayed under Greene's personal command. The other, roughly 1,000 men, went to Daniel Morgan. Morgan was a 50-something-year-old brigadier general from the Shenandoah Valley who had come out of retirement to take the assignment, and his history with the British was considerably more personal than that of most American officers. In 1756, as a young wagon driver attached to Braddock's campaign during the French and Indian War, Morgan had struck a British officer who had hit him first with the flat of a sword. The court-martial sentenced him to 500 lashes, a punishment that at the time was widely understood to be a death sentence. Morgan survived the flogging and carried the scars on his back for the rest of his life. He spent the rest of his years telling the story with the addition that the British had miscounted and given him only 499, meaning they still owed him one. He was a man who had literally been beaten by the British Army and walked away. He did not come to Cowpens with an abstract commitment to the patriot cause. He came with 25 years of personal scores to settle. His record in the war bore out the reputation. At Saratoga in 1777, his rifle corps had operated in the woods around Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights with an effectiveness that genuinely alarmed Burgoyne, specifically targeting officers and artillery crews from concealment at ranges a smoothbore musket could never have reached. His sharpshooters were directly credited, at least in part, with the killing of Brigadier General Simon Fraser at Bemis Heights, the moment many historians point to as the turning point of that battle. Morgan had then spent years watching the Continental Congress pass him over for promotion, watching men with better political connections advance above him, before finally resigning his commission in frustration in 1779. He came back to the Southern campaign only after the Camden disaster, when Greene sought him out specifically and Congress finally gave him the brigadier general's rank he had been owed for years. He arrived in the South carrying both a military reputation and a personal grudge, and those were not the same thing, but they pointed in the same direction. Cornwallis, recognizing that Morgan's detached force was a direct threat to his left flank and to the British outpost at 96, sent Tarleton after him with orders to destroy him. Tarleton set out in pursuit with roughly 1,100 men, a force built around his own British Legion cavalry and infantry. Supported by detachments from the 7th Regiment of Foot, the 16th and 17th Light Dragoons, the 71st Highland Regiment, and 2 3-pounder cannon. It was, on paper, far more than sufficient to deal with Morgan's 1,000 men. Tarleton pushed the pursuit relentlessly, crossing flooded rivers, building boats where needed, covering ground at a pace that left his own column in increasingly poor condition with each passing day. In the 5 days before Cowpens, according to historian Lawrence Babbitts, whose detailed tactical account remains the most authoritative study of the battle, Tarleton's command had fewer than 4 hours of sleep in 48 hours and had run out of food entirely. When Tarleton roused his column at 2 a.m. of January 17th to resume the march, his men had not eaten a proper meal in days, had barely slept all week, and were crossing the South Carolina backcountry in the bitter cold of January on horseback and on foot. He pressed on anyway, because he had never yet failed to catch someone he was chasing, and had no reason to believe this time would be different. Morgan received word that Tarleton was closing in on the afternoon of January 16th and found himself in a difficult position. The broad river was behind him, running high with winter flooding, and attempting to cross it in the dark with Tarleton hours behind would mean crossing with a divided force and risking being hit in the water. He had to turn and fight. The place he chose to do it was a well-known local cattle grazing ground called Hannah's Cowpens, and he chose it for reasons that made some of his officers uncomfortable. The field was open, lightly wooded with mature trees and no heavy undergrowth, roughly half a mile wide. There was no concealing terrain in which his militia could hide. More pressingly, he positioned his entire force with the broad river at their backs and the Pacolet River to their flank, deliberately cutting off any practical escape route. His officers worried about this arrangement. Morgan's reasoning was blunt. He told them that he knew his militia. If they had somewhere to run, some of them would run. If there was nowhere to go, they would fight. The terrain was not a weakness. It was a mechanism for concentrating the minds of men who might otherwise decide to leave. Through the evening of January 16th, as the rest of Colonel Andrew Picken's militia arrived in camp from the surrounding countryside, Morgan moved through his men by firelight, talking to as many of them as he could. Multiple accounts from participants describe him circulating through the camp until late at night, shaking hands, explaining the plan, cracking jokes, rallying the whole force with a directness that no formal parade ground officer could have managed. He was a frontiersman talking to frontiersmen, a man they recognized as one of their own kind, and the argument he made to them was not sentimental. He told his militia exactly what he needed from them and exactly why they could do it. 2 volleys and then fall back behind the Continentals. That was all he was asking. 2 volleys, then move around the left to reform behind the ridge. And he told them what Tarleton's men had done to the men who surrendered to them. The militia understood what that meant. At Cowpens, giving up was not a practical option. The only exit was through Tarleton's force, and that meant fighting. By dawn on January 17th, Morgan had his 3 lines arranged on the slope. 150 skirmishers, the best shots in the force, formed the most forward position on the field, posted to take deliberate aim at British officers and artillery crews before they fell back. Behind them, 300 militia under Pickens held the second line. Their orders identical: fire twice as carefully as possible, targeting officers in the front rank rather than the mass of infantry behind them, and then withdraw to the left around the hill to regroup. These orders were explicit and specific, not a vague instruction to hold as long as possible and then run. Morgan had given the militia a clear task with a defined endpoint. And that specificity was, by design, the difference between an ordered retreat and a rout. And on the crest of the slope, 550 Continental Regulars and Virginia riflemen under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard held the third line, the force that was not going to fall back under any circumstances, the foundation everything else was built on. Behind the ridge, out of sight of anyone approaching up the slope from Tarleton's direction, 100 cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel William Washington waited in reserve, hidden by the fold of ground above the third line, invisible from below. Tarleton reached the field before full light and began forming his own line without giving his exhausted men any meaningful rest. He placed his infantry in the center, with cavalry on both flanks, and his 2 cannon positioned in the line. The standard aggressive deployment he had used in every successful action of his career. A brief survey of the ground revealed the American lines ahead of him on the slope, and everything he saw told him what he had seen a dozen times before in the Carolina campaign. Militia in front, regulars behind, the exact formation that had broken and run every time the British pressed it hard enough. He sent a screen of dragoons forward to harass the American front and ordered the main advance. It was 7 in the morning, barely light. Tarleton's infantry marched toward the slope. The first line of American skirmishers opened fire from a longer range than the British expected, specifically targeting officers and the crews of Tarleton's 2 cannon with deliberate aimed shots rather than mass volleys, and then pulled back behind the second line in good order. The sight of Americans retreating triggered exactly the response Morgan had designed it to trigger. Tarleton's infantry pushed forward faster, convinced this was already the beginning of a collapse. Pickens's militia fired 2 volleys at close range, inflicting severe casualties on the advancing British, and then withdrew to the left around the base of the hill exactly as ordered, in a controlled movement that looked, from the advancing British line, like a retreat becoming a rout. Tarleton, seeing the second line of Americans apparently breaking, committed his cavalry to pursue them and pressed his infantry forward into what he believed was a beaten force with nowhere to go. They ran directly into Howard's Continental line on the crest of the slope, which had not moved at all. What happened next involved the kind of accident that battle narratives usually try to smooth over, but which the best accounts of Cowpens have preserved honestly because the accident was as decisive as the plan. A misheard or misinterpreted order caused the right wing of Howard's Continentals to begin wheeling inward rather than maintaining the line. And this movement spread along their section of the line until it looked, briefly, like the American third line was also beginning to break. Morgan galloped over the moment he saw it, confirmed from Howard that the men were still under control, and made the decision that defined the battle. He ordered Howard to halt the movement, face the men about, and fire. The Continentals stopped, turned, and delivered a volley into Tarleton's men, who had been rushing forward in pursuit at a distance of less than 30 yards. The close-range volley was devastating, and the British line, already disordered by its own advance and by the fire from the first 2 American lines, could not absorb it. In the same minutes that Howard's men turned and fired, Washington's cavalry came over the ridge and hit the British right flank. Pickens's militia, having completed their circuit around the base of the hill, reformed and came back in against the British left. What had been a charging British assault was suddenly surrounded on three sides, struck from the front, both flanks, and from behind where Washington's horsemen cut off the retreat. The British 7th Regiment of Foot, professional infantry, who had entered the field confident of victory, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The 71st Highlanders, MacArthur's regiment, broke and ran. Tarleton tried to rally his cavalry for a countercharge and was refused by most of them, his Legion troopers declining to ride into the chaos that surrounded what remained of his command. He escaped with 54 men, leaving behind every piece of his artillery, 800 stand-of-arms, 2 regimental standards, 35 wagons, and the substantial majority of his force either dead or in American hands. Washington personally pursued Tarleton across the open ground south of the battlefield and caught him at the edge of the wood, where the two commanders fought a brief personal engagement with sabers. 2 of Tarleton's officers attacked Washington from behind, one of them nearly cutting him down before Washington's bugler shot the man with a pistol. Tarleton himself fired a parting shot that killed Washington's horse as he broke away and fled, the last action he took on the field before disappearing into the tree line with his surviving dragoons. Among the British prisoners taken was Major Archibald MacArthur of the 71st Highlanders, an experienced officer who had been fighting in the South since the beginning of the campaign. His assessment of what had happened was recorded by American officers who spoke with him after the battle. MacArthur said in their accounts that he had been an officer before Tarleton was born, that the best troops in the British service had been placed under that boy's command, and that those men had been sacrificed. It was a professional soldier's verdict on a professional failure, delivered by a man who had just watched his regiment destroyed in a field that should not have been lost. The strategic consequences of that hour on the Cowpens pasture moved outward for the next 9 months and reached further than anyone standing on that ground on January 17th could have clearly seen. Cornwallis, furious and determined to recover his prisoners and restore his army's ability to operate in the interior of the Carolinas, stripped his force of its supply wagons to move faster and drove north in pursuit of Morgan. He did not catch him. He met Nathanael Greene's combined force at Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781, won the field in a costly engagement, and arrived at the coast at Wilmington so badly weakened by casualties and exhaustion that he could no longer campaign in the Carolinas at all. He moved north to Virginia, seeking a position from which to rest and refit, and ended up at Yorktown. The rest of the story belongs to a siege and a French fleet, but the chain of decisions that put Cornwallis on that peninsula began on a January morning when Tarleton attacked a slope full of men who had nowhere to run and saw in that lack of options a reason to stay and fight. The Cowpens battlefield is a national park today, an 845-acre site outside Chesney, South Carolina, where a well-marked walking trail follows the movement of each of the 3 American lines across the gently rolling ground. The terrain is quiet in the way that former battlefields are quiet when the ground itself is all that remains of what happened there. The slope where Howard's Continentals held, the swale where the militia completed their circuit behind the ridge, the wood line where Tarleton disappeared into the trees with his 54 survivors, it is farmland now, passable in an hour. The distances between positions shorter than they look on any map. Morgan said before the battle that it was here that he would find either his grave or his victory. He got his victory and then went home to Virginia, retired by chronic sciatica that made riding impossible, and spent the rest of his life on a farm called Soldier's Rest. Congress gave him a gold medal in 1790 for what he had done there. It was a long time coming, and probably insufficient. Hit subscribe to see more stories like this one.